You are standing in the gardens of Nero's private palace on the Esquiline Hill. It is late evening, 19 July, in the year 64 AD. The air is thick with smoke that smells of cedar, pine, and something sweeter, burning human fat. Torches are moving along the paths, but these are not ordinary torches. They are living people, men, women, teenagers, sewn into tunics, soaked in pitch and wax. Iron spikes have been driven through their wrists and ankles to hold them upright on tall poles. Their hair and beards are already on fire. Some are still screaming. Others have gone quiet, mouths open, eyes reflecting the flames that are eating them alive. A senator named Tacitus, who has seen every kind of cruelty Rome can invent, turns away and vomits into a rosebush. Nero laughs, raises a golden cup, and toasts his guests, "Let there be light." This is not a scene from a horror film, this actually happened, and what you are about to hear is the part of Nero's persecution that Roman historians themselves tried to whisper about for centuries. The part that made even blood-drenched senators beg the emperor to stop. The part that turned Christians into human candles, human crucifixes, human hunting prey, not just to kill them, but to erase the very idea that they had ever been human. Hollywood gave you the Colosseum lions. What I'm about to show you is the systematic state-sponsored nightmare that happened in the palaces, gardens, and back alleys of Rome itself, night after night, for months. The Romans didn't need a special word for it because, for a brief, terrifying moment under Nero, it simply became the new normal. It began with fire. On the night of 18 July 64, a small flame started in the wooden shops near the Circus Maximus. Within hours, it became an inferno that devoured 2/3 of the city. 10 of Rome's 14 districts were reduced to blackened ruins, hundreds of temples, thousands of homes, entire neighborhoods gone. The fire burned for 6 days, then mysteriously flared up again for 3 more. Rumors exploded immediately. Nero had ordered the blaze to clear land for his monstrous new palace, the Domus Aurea. People saw figures in military cloaks cutting water pipes and preventing citizens from fighting the flames. Nero himself was 35 miles away in Antium when it started, but he raced back and threw open his gardens to the homeless. Still, the whispers grew louder. Someone had to pay. Nero needed a scapegoat that was small enough to crush, foreign enough to hate, and already rumored to practice secret nocturnal rites. The Christians fit perfectly. They were a tiny sect, maybe a few thousand in the whole city, mostly poor, many slaves or freedmen, led by strange ideas about a crucified Jewish carpenter who rose from the dead. They refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods. They called each other brother and sister. They met before dawn in catacombs. To ordinary Romans, they already sounded like a cannibal death cult. All Nero had to do was light the match. According to Tacitus, writing only 50 years later, Nero inflicted the most exquisite tortures on people hated for their abominable crimes. The historian uses the phrase subdidit reos, fabricated the guilty. Everyone knew the charges were invented, but no one dared say it out loud. The arrests began within days. Entire households, men, women, small children, were dragged from the Subura slums and the Transtiberium ghetto. Some were betrayed by their own slaves for reward money. Others were pointed out by neighbors who wanted their apartments. The prisons overflowed so quickly that Nero commandeered private villas and circus stables as temporary dungeons. What happened next was not random mob violence. This was a carefully choreographed festival of pain, designed by the emperor himself and his prefect Tigellinus, staged across multiple venues, advertised in advance, and attended by the entire city, senators, knights, plebs, even foreign ambassadors. Nero turned the persecution into Rome's newest form of public entertainment. And the things he did were so extreme that Tacitus, a man who watched men fight lions for fun, calls them cruelties that defied description. The first wave was crucifixion, but not the quick military version. Victims were nailed upside down, or with their legs broken first, or with iron hooks through their jaws so they couldn't scream insults at the crowd. Some were crucified in the shape of a giant flaming enna across the Vatican hill, then an empty marsh outside the city. At night, their crosses were wrapped in straw and set alight so Nero's dinner guests could watch the burning forest of bodies from across the Tiber. But crucifixion was too familiar. Rome had seen hundreds of thousands die that way. Nero wanted novelty. That's when he invented the human torches. He called them his living lamps. Tacitus says Nero first tested the idea on a handful of condemned arsonists, non-Christians, in the imperial gardens on the Esquiline. The pitch-soaked tunics caught so beautifully, the flames so steady and golden, that the emperor decided to scale it up. Within a week, the Vatican gardens, a private park belonging to Nero's mother Agrippina, now conveniently dead, were transformed into a nighttime necropolis of fire. The process was chillingly bureaucratic. Each Christian selected for illumination was stripped, scrubbed, and shaved of all body hair so the flammable mixture would adhere evenly. A team of imperial slaves, specialists in theatrical costumes, sewed them into fresh tunics made of coarse linen, soaked for days in a vat of pitch, wax, and sulfur. Iron spikes were driven through wrists and ankles into wooden poles 20 feet high. A small iron cage was sometimes fitted around the head so the face would remain visible longer. Then the poles were hoisted into pre-dug holes along the main garden avenues, exactly 30 paces apart, like trees in a formal orchard. At dusk, Nero would arrive in a gilded litter, surrounded by his Augustiani, the claque of young aristocrats paid to applaud everything he did. Musicians played soft flutes and lyres while servants poured scented oil on the paths so the smoke would smell sweet. When the emperor gave the signal, slaves with long torches touched flame to the first victim. The fire climbed slowly at first, licking up the legs, then roared upward in a single whoosh. The screaming lasted anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 minutes, depending on wind and how much pitch had been used. Some victims tried to shorten their agony by leaning forward into the flames. The spikes held them upright. One young girl, Tacitus, mentions her specifically sang a hymn until her hair caught fire and her voice turned into something not human. Senators were required to attend. Refusal meant treason. Paetus, the Stoic senator I mentioned earlier, wrote in a letter that survived, "I have seen men torn apart by wild beasts and thought that the limit of cruelty. I was wrong. These fires are worse because they are beautiful." But the gardens were only the dress rehearsal. Nero wanted the entire city to watch. He announced a series of night festivals in the Circus Vaticanus, the same marshy ground where St. Peter's Basilica stands today. Admission was free. Vendors sold honeyed wine and hot sausages. The main event began after sunset. Hundreds of Christians, sometimes as many as 300 in a single night, were brought out in chains. Some were already dressed as mythological criminals, a man as Prometheus with an iron beak hammered into his liver area so a trained vulture could tear at him while he burned. Women as Danaids carrying flaming jars that poured molten pitch down their own bodies, others sewn into freshly skinned. Animal hides, bears, deer, wolves, so the packs of starving hunting dogs would rip them apart before the flames finished the job. One spectacle became infamous even by Roman standards. Nero staged a reenactment of the myth of Hercules burning on Mount Ota. A Christian deacon named Lawrence, later Saint Lawrence, was chosen for the starring role. Instead of the traditional funeral pyre, he was stretched naked on a giant iron gridiron suspended above a slow charcoal fire. Slaves turned him every few minutes like meat on a spit. According to later Christian tradition, after hours of this he looked up at the emperor and said, "This side is done, turn me over." The crowd laughed. Nero loved the joke so much he repeated it for weeks. Word of these nights spread across the empire. Foreign visitors wrote home in horror. The Greek historian Apollonius of Tyana, visiting Rome at the time, reportedly told his students, "Nero has found a way to make murder decorative." Yet something unexpected began to happen. The more spectacular the tortures became, the more the crowd's mood shifted. At first they cheered every fresh invention, then they grew silent, then some began to weep openly. Tacitus records that a deep pity seized the populace because the victims died with such calm and courage, praying aloud, forgiving their executioners, sometimes even smiling. The very excess meant to terrorize people instead started to humanize the Christians. Nero noticed. He became furious. He doubled the cruelty, hoping to force the audience back into hatred. That's when he introduced the beast hunts, but with a twist that made even Tigellinus hesitate. He called them the morning games of the Lord's people. Every dawn, for weeks, while the city still stank of smoke and melted lead from the great fire, the imperial beast handlers opened the cages beneath Nero's private amphitheater in the gardens of Maecenas. The Christians were not thrown to lions the way Hollywood shows. Lions were expensive and slow. Nero wanted volume, speed, and above all, intimacy. He wanted the crowd to smell blood before breakfast. The victims were marched out naked, wrists bound behind their backs, in groups of 50. Many had already spent days in the Tullianum, the ancient state prison under the Capitoline Hill, where the only light came through a hole in the ceiling and the floor was ankle-deep in sewage. By the time they reached the sand, they were skeletal, blind from darkness, and half mad from thirst. This was deliberate. Nero had learned that half-dead prey ran unpredictably, which made the dogs frantic. The dogs were not ordinary mastiffs. They were specially bred Molossian hounds from Epirus, starved for 3 days, and fed raw meat soaked in human blood, so they associated the center people with food. When the gates opened, the pack, sometimes 40 or 50 animals, poured out in a single black and tan wave. The Christians had no weapons, no armor, not even clothes to slow the tearing. The first bite was usually to the calves or genitals. Once a victim fell, the dogs went for the soft belly and face. Spectators in the lower rows were sometimes spattered with arterial spray that reached 10 meters. One morning, Nero escalated again. He ordered children used as bait. Roman sources are almost silent about this. Tacitus mentions it in a single chilling sentence and then moves on, but later Christian writers preserved the memory. Boys and girls under 10 were tied to small wooden posts in the center of the arena. The dogs were released one at a time, muzzled at first, then unmuzzled when the child began to scream. The parents, held back by guards, were forced to watch. Some fainted. Some tried to throw themselves onto the dogs and were clubbed unconscious. One woman, her name is recorded in the Acts of St. Prisca, broke free, ran into the pack, and wrapped her body around her daughter. The dogs tore them both apart together. The crowd, which had laughed at everything else, went deathly quiet. Even the Praetorian prefect Tigellinus, a man who once organized orgies on floating barges where guests drowned in wine, reportedly turned to Nero and whispered, "Caesar, enough. The people are starting to pity them more than they hate them. Nero's reply has come down to us, then we must teach them what pity costs." That night, he staged the most theatrical massacre of the entire persecution. He called it the Wedding of Attis. Attis, in Phrygian myth, was a beautiful youth loved by the goddess Cybele, who castrated himself in a frenzy and bled to death under a pine tree. Nero decided to recreate the story with living actors. 30 young Christian men chosen because they were virgins, and therefore, in Nero's twisted logic, perfect parallels to Attis, were dressed in translucent silk robes dyed saffron yellow. Their hair was curled and perfumed. They were given dull knives and led into a temporary wooden arena built in the Campus Marcius, decorated with thousands of pine boughs. The crowd was told the men would castrate themselves voluntarily in honor of the Great Mother. When they refused, Nero's stagehands released packs of wild boars that had been starved and had their tusks sharpened with iron tips. The boars charged. The men tried to climb the pine trees. The branches had been greased. One by one, they slipped and fell. The boars disemboweled them from groin to sternum. The last survivor, a teenage boy named Crescentius, climbed to the very top of the tallest tree and hung there for nearly an hour while the crowd begged Nero to spare him. Nero stood up, smiled, and ordered archers to shoot flaming arrows into the pine. The tree became a torch. The boy did not scream. He simply let go and fell straight into the boars. Senators, who had applauded every previous horror, began leaving the stands before it was over. Some openly wept. The next day, graffiti appeared on walls near the Forum. Nero burns Rome twice, once with fire, once with shame. For the first time in his reign, Nero began to feel the ground shift beneath him. The emperor's paranoia now fed on itself, like a snake eating its own tail. By late autumn 64, the arrests had widened far beyond the original scapegoats. Anyone who had ever sheltered a Christian, anyone who refused to sprinkle incense on an altar to Nero's genius, anyone whose face simply displeased a Praetorian on patrol, all were now suspect. The city lived under a rain of whispered denunciations. A baker in the Suburra disappeared because he gave bread to a family whose house had burned. A schoolteacher was crucified because he taught Greek philosophy that sounded suspiciously like turning the other cheek. The prisons were so full that new ones had to be improvised in the vaults beneath the Circus Flaminius. The stench of rotting bodies drifted across entire neighborhoods. Nero sensed the tide turning. He needed one final spectacle, something so overwhelming that it would drown pity in terror again. He chose the imperial banquet halls themselves. He called it the Feast of the Fishes. In the vast triclinium of the Domus Transitoria, the palace the fire had only partially destroyed, Nero ordered a banquet for 2,000 guests, every senator, every knight of consequence, every foreign ambassador still in the city. The ceiling was painted midnight blue and studded with real stars, ivory constellations that rotated by hidden machinery. The floor was a single sheet of transparent alabaster over a shallow pool. Beneath the alabaster swam living lampreys and moray eels. At the climax of the evening, slaves rolled back sections of the floor like theatre flats. Christians, men, women, children were revealed standing waist deep in the water, chained to iron posts. The guests reclined above them on couches, wine cups in hand. Nero gave a signal. The lampreys were starved for weeks and maddened with blood poured into the pool. When the chains were released, the victims tried to climb the smooth alabaster walls. Their fingernails snapped. The morays struck first, tearing off fingers and ears. Then the lampreys attached themselves in black clusters to legs and genitals, burrowing into flesh with their circular mouths of teeth. The screams echoed off the gilded ceiling while the guests watched from inches away, faces lit by the rotating stars. One senator, Gaius Musonius Rufus, stood up and walked out. Others followed. Nero pretended not to notice, but his hands shook so badly he spilled wine down his purple robe like blood. The next morning the city woke to find every public fountain running red. Someone no one ever discovered who had poured bull's blood into the main aqueducts overnight. On the statue of Nero in the Forum someone had painted in charcoal, "You have made us drink blood, now drink it yourself." That was the moment the mask finally slipped. Even Nero's own household began to fracture. His tutor Seneca, already in disgrace, wrote him a letter that survives in fragments. "You have exhausted cruelty. There is nothing left to invent that will not turn against you." The Praetorian prefect Burrus had died the previous year poisoned, most believed, on Nero's orders, but the new prefect, Tigellinus, now saw which way the wind was blowing. He began quietly distancing himself, refusing to sign certain execution lists. The breaking point came with a single woman. Her name was Pomponia Graecina, wife of Aulus Plautius, the conqueror of Britain, one of the most aristocratic women in Rome. She had been under suspicion for decades for foreign superstition. Everyone knew she was Christian. Nero decided to make an example of the nobility itself. She was arrested in December 64 and sentenced to die in the old Republican fashion, handed over to her family for private execution. Roman law allowed patrician women accused of certain crimes to be killed by their own male relatives rather than publicly shamed. On the appointed day, the entire Senate was summoned to the Plautius mansion on the Caelian hill to witness. Pomponia appeared in plain white, hair unbound, calm as winter water. Her husband was ordered to strangle her with his own hands. He refused. Finally, Nero sent German bodyguards to do it. They dragged her into the atrium. She looked once at the household shrine, made the sign of the cross, and said in perfect Latin, loud enough for the senators outside to hear, "You can kill the body, but the fire you lit will never go out." They strangled her with a silk cord. Her body was carried out on a bier. The senators' men, who had applauded every previous horror, stood in total silence as the procession passed. Not one voice cried, "Hail Caesar!" That night, for the first time since the persecution began, no new fires were lit in the Vatican gardens. The poles stood empty, blackened skeletons against the moon. Nero never recovered. The persecution didn't end with a thunderclap. It ended with a whimper that echoed for centuries. By spring 65, the city was exhausted. The novelty had curdled. The smell of pitch and charred flesh clung to every toga. Senators who once competed to invent new tortures now avoided the palace. The Augustiani Nero's paid clappers stopped showing up. Tigellinus quietly released hundreds of prisoners whose paperwork had somehow gone missing. The machine simply ran out of fuel, no more public appetite, no more political profit, and most dangerous for Nero, no more fear. The Christians did not vanish, they went underground in the most literal sense. While Nero was still alive, they were already burying their dead in the soft tufa rock outside the city walls, painting simple fish and bread on the ceilings of what would become the catacombs. Every martyr Nero made seeded 10 new believers. Tacitus, writing 50 years later, admits it with visible discomfort. The more we slaughtered them, the more they multiplied. Their obstinacy looked like courage, and courage is contagious. Nero himself never faced justice for the fire or the torches. 4 years later, in June 68, the Senate declared him public enemy. He fled Rome dressed as a slave, hid in a freedman's villa, and stabbed himself in the throat with a dagger he was too shaky to hold properly. His last words, according to Suetonius, were "Qualis artifex perio." What an artist dies in me. The artist who lit human beings like candles died alone, whimpering for someone to finish the job. The bodies in the Vatican gardens were never counted. Modern archaeologists working beneath St. Peter's have found mass graves from the Neronian period, charred bones mixed with iron spikes, fragments of pitch-soaked cloth still clinging to rib cages, children's skeletons curled into the fetal position. One grave contained the remains of at least 27 individuals in a single pit, no larger than a modern living room. Any analysis shows many were from the eastern provinces, Syria, Judea, Asia Minor, exactly the immigrant poor who made up Rome's early Christian community. The memory was too radioactive even for pagan Rome. Later emperors Vespasian, Titus, Trajan never repeated anything on this scale. When Pliny the Younger asked Trajan in 1112 AD how to handle Christians, the emperor's reply was almost embarrassed: "Don't hunt them down, don't accept anonymous accusations, and if they're brought to trial and refuse to sacrifice, execute them quickly. No spectacles, no gardens, no living torches." The state had learned that theatrical cruelty backfires. Yet the physical evidence never went away. Walk today through the necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the one tourists rarely see. The Vatican only opened it to scholars after 1940. You pass 2nd century Christian tombs built directly on top of a 1st century bone layer that is unmistakably Neronian. Heat-fractured skulls, vertebrae fused by fire, tiny ankle bones still wearing the ghost of iron shackles. The lowest level is sealed behind glass now, but the smell, faint, acrid, unmistakable, still rises when the humidity is high. Above it, layer after layer of Christian graves climb toward the high altar. Every pope from Peter onward is buried in a direct vertical line over Nero's killing field. The church built its holiest shrine on the exact spot where Nero tried to erase it with fire. The victims won, and Rome itself never forgot what it had watched. For centuries afterward, any emperor who even hinted at persecuting Christians was reminded quietly, in the Senate, in the barracks, in the streets of the night. The city smelled human fat burning in its gardens. The collective trauma became a silent boundary. You can tax them, exile them, execute them quietly, but never again turn murder into public art. Nero had crossed a line that even pagans could feel in their bones. Today, 2 million tourists a year ride escalators up to the dome of St. Peter's, take selfies in the piazza, buy gelato, and never notice that they are standing on a Holocaust that happened 16 centuries before the word existed. The torches are long cold. The iron spikes have rusted into red dust, but if you stand in a scavi at closing time, when the lights dim and the last guide is gone, you can still hear it, not with your ears, but somewhere deeper, the soft pop of pitch catching, the crackle of hair, a child singing in Aramaic until the flames take her voice. That is the real legacy of Nero's persecution. He wanted to light Rome so brightly that no one would ever forget his name. He succeeded, but the light people remember is not his, it is theirs. If this shook you the way it should have, share it. Drop a comment with the city you're reading this from. And subscribe, because the past still has darker rooms we haven't opened yet. I'll see you in the next one.